In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is the traditional translation of the first verse of John's Gospel into English. However, this translation is not without dispute. For example, the New World Translation of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, used by the Jehovah's Witnesses, reads, quote, "And the Word was a God." The consequences of this translational disparity influence whether or not John is telling the reader that Jesus is truly God. What is the reason behind the disputes over John chapter 1, verse 1? In the original Greek, John 1:1 reads, quote, "En ἀρχῇ ein ho logos, kai ho logos ein pros ton theon, kai theos ein ho logos." The controversy revolves around the third clause of this verse. In order to know how to properly translate this passage, we have to become familiar with some basic principles of the Greek language. The words we are primarily concerned with to understand the theology of John 1:1 are nouns. You may remember from school that nouns are persons, places, or things. Greek nouns can take one of three declensions. Within these declensions, every Greek noun can be used in one of four cases: nominative, genitive, dative, or accusative. The nominative case is used for a subject noun, what a sentence or statement is about. Genitives are used when referring to a source, think of or from. Datives are flexible, but can be summed up for our purposes as indirect objects. Finally, accusative cases are used for nouns serving as direct objects. In English, a noun retains its form regardless of its use, so we identify the case of the noun by the context of word order. However, Greek works differently. Greek is not restricted by word order the way English is. Instead, the form of the noun changes with respect to its case. Each case is marked by a specific ending. These endings are called case forms. The two nouns that we are addressing in regards to the proper understanding of John chapter 1 verse 1 are Theos, God, and Logos, Word. Both of these nouns are masculine, second declension in their form. So we will look at the masculine, second declension case endings that identify the use of the noun. The nominative is marked by the ending omicron sigma, os, in the singular, and omicron iota, oi, in the plural. Genitives are marked by the endings omicron upsilon, u, in the singular, and omega nu, on, in the plural. Datives by the ending o, omega, with an iota subscript, in the singular, and ois or oisi, omicron iota sigma or omicron iota sigma iota, in the plural. Finally, accusatives are marked by the ending omicron nu, on, in the singular, and omicron upsilon sigma, us, in the plural. In John 1:1, Theos, God, and Logos, Word, only appear collectively in two cases, nominative and accusative, singular. So, we will only concern ourselves with these two respective forms, again ending in os, omicron sigma, in the nominative, and on, omicron nu, in the accusative. In addition, Greek nouns can be rendered with or without the article. Articles show the definiteness of the nouns they are in reference to. In English, we display the article as either definite, the word the, or indefinite, the word a. The form of the article specifies the noun being referenced. For example, the dog versus a dog. In Greek, specifically Koine Greek, the common form of ancient Greek in which the New Testament is written, the definite article, the word the, takes on the same case as the noun it is in reference to. The masculine second declension form of the definite article in the nominative case is ho. In the accusative, it is ton. These are the two forms of the definite article that we see in John chapter 1, verse 1. Ancient speakers of Koine Greek had an affinity for using the definite article, much more so than we do as modern English speakers. For this reason, the article is not always translated into English, because it wouldn't make sense for an English speaker. Here's an example from John chapter 1, verse 4. En ἀβτῷ zoe ein, kai he zoe ein tophos ton ἀνθρώπων. Notice that there are three occurrences of the definite article in this verse. A strictly literal translation of this passage would read, quote, "In him was life, and the life was the light of the men." To English-speaking ears, this translation is not idiomatically correct. Notice now how this verse is translated to match proper English idiom. To render the verse in proper English, Bible translators consistently drop the article, the, before ἀνθρώπων, translated as men or mankind. As English speakers, we understand that even though the article was not translated, this doesn't affect the meaning of the verse. In this case, because there is only one mankind that could be in reference. There are not multiple mankind's. The Watchtower has done the same thing in the New World Translation's rendering of this verse. By means of him was life, and the life was the light of men. Not translating the definite article out of Greek into English is not about theology. It is about abiding by proper grammar. In contrast to the definite article, there is no indefinite article, the word in Greek. So how do we know if a noun is indefinite? Very simply, indefinite nouns will lack an article. Here's an example from John chapter 1, verse 6. Egenetal anthropos apostomenos para theou onoma ἀvτῷ Ioannes. In English, this passage reads as follows. The same word that we examined in John chapter 1, verse 4, anthropos, appears again here in verse 6, this time in the nominative singular case, rather than the genitive plural. This time, however, there is no article to accompany the noun. Thus, it is translated indefinitely into English by the use of the word in this case, a man. With all of that being said, let's return to verse 1. Orthodox translations and the New World Translation are in agreement for the first two clauses of this verse, so we will be concentrating on the third clause. Note the presence of the two nouns, theos and logos. You'll note also the presence of the article, ho, before logos, but not before theos. Based strictly on the Greek word order, the English equivalent of this passage would be, quote, and God was the Word. Now, let's account for the absence of the article before theos. Keeping in mind what we've already discussed about the translation of indefinite nouns out of Greek into English, this would seem to indicate that the English reading of this passage is, quote, and a God was the Word. This is the crux of the argument for why the Jehovah's Witnesses translate John chapter 1, verse 1 the way they do. Theos, God, lacks an article. Thus, they say, God should be rendered indefinitely as a God. If we stopped here, it would appear the Jehovah's Witnesses have a closed case. However, no translation renders verse 1 in this way. Every translation, the New World Translation included, begins the third clause of the first verse with, and the Word was. So there's obviously something else going on in this passage that we have not yet accounted for. What is that? Sometimes, definite nouns will also lack an article, so we always have to consider the context of what is being said. We have an example of this in a verse we've already looked at, verse number 6. The word for God, theou, appears in the genitive singular case. This is the same word rendered 2 times in verse 1 as God, albeit in a different case. The argument could be made in this instance that theou is indefinite because it lacks its corresponding article and should be thusly translated as a God. However, this is not the case, because we know which God John is referring to, Yahweh or Jehovah. As such, theou is properly rendered in English as God, capital G. Note again how the Jehovah's Witnesses have rendered this verse in the New World Translation. Even though there is no article before God in the Greek, they have still correctly translated this verse by rendering God as definite rather than indefinite. Again, the proper translation of a verse is not about theology. It is about grammar and context. The Apostle John is telling us that John the Baptist was sent by Yahweh, Jehovah, not, quote, a God of some kind. Let's go back to where we left off with verse 1. Now that we've established that the lack of an article before theos does not necessarily indicate that it is indefinite, what further steps can we take to make sense of what John has written? Remember the question I asked earlier. How come the word order in Greek reads, quote, and God was, but it's consistently translated as, quote, and the Word was? Recall that word order in Greek is not of the same importance as it is in English for conveying the meaning of a statement. To identify the subject of the statement, we must look for a noun in the nominative case, in this instance with an omicron sigma os ending. However, at this point, we run into a problem. We have 2 nouns that are in the nominative case, theos and logos. Both have the distinctive nominative case ending of omicron sigma, os. So, how do we know which one is the subject? Compare, for example, the third clause with the second clause of verse 1. The English translation of this clause is not disputed. All translations, including the New World Translation, render this clause as, quote, and the Word was with God. Why? Notice that logos here is in the nominative case. This identifies it as the subject of this clause. Now, look at the word for God, theon. We have seen this word previously in 2 other places. the third clause of verse 1, and in verse 6. However, you can see that it is in yet a different case from the two instances we have already examined. Here, in the second clause of verse 1, the on is in the accusative case, as identified by the omicron nu un ending. Recall that the accusative case is used for direct objects. God here is the direct object of the word, which explains why theon is written in this form. In this clause, theon is accompanied by the article, ton. John includes the article here because he wants to specify which God he is referring to, the Creator God, Yahweh, Jehovah. But why does John include the article here and not in the third clause? Look at the word endings. Only logos is in the nominative case. Theon is in the accusative case. Theon is not the subject of this clause. Therefore, it is not identified with logos, the word. Returning to the third clause, which of these two nominative nouns is the subject of the clause, the os or logos? Here we encounter something called a predicate nominative. The rules of Greek grammar state that when we have an instance, such as this, with two nouns in the nominative case, the nominative subject will have the article, while the nominative predicate will lose the article. If we divide a sentence into two parts, one containing the subject and the other containing the verbal idea, the portion of the sentence containing the verbal idea is called the predicate. When the verb is an action verb, the predicate may contain direct objects and indirect objects. But when the verb is a linking verb, nouns in the predicate that are connected with the subject by means of the linking verb are nominatives. Linking verbs take a predicate nominative. In the case of the third clause of verse 1, the verb is a linking verb, ein, was. What is ein linking together? Theos, God, and ho logos, the word. That these two nouns are to be linked in their understanding is evident based on their both being in the nominative case. The fact that logos has the article, while theos does not, makes it clear that John is telling us something about the word, namely, that the word was qualitatively God. In other words, the word was God by his nature or essence. This means that when we translate this passage into English, where word order is used to convey the relationship of the nouns, we reverse the word order from the Greek. Thus, we recite the verse properly as, quote, and the word was God, because the word is the subject, and God is the predicate nominative. Thus, John's words are inescapable. The Word, Jesus, was God, just as the Father. Quote, there is a balance between the word's deity, which was already present in the beginning, and his humanity, which was added later. The grammatical structures of these two statements mirrors each other. Both emphasize the nature of the Word, rather than his identity. But theos was his nature from eternity, while sarx was added at the incarnation. Such an option does not at all impugn the deity of Christ. Rather, it stresses that, although the person of Christ is not the person of the Father, their essence is identical. The idea of a qualitative theos here is that the Word had all the attributes and qualities that, quote, the God of the second clause had. In other words, he shared the essence of the Father, though they differed in person. The construction the evangelist chose to express this idea was the most concise way he could have stated that the Word was God, and yet was distinct from the Father.